Michael Daniels was reaching for his wallet at the Maple Ridge Mall parking lot when he saw the man's hand shoot toward his daughter's backpack. The stranger's fingers were inches from Sophie's pink unicorn bag when Michael's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. What happened next would turn an ordinary Saturday shopping trip into a scene that police would reference in their training manuals for years to come, because the man who tried to grab that backpack had no idea who he was dealing with, and more importantly, he had no idea about the phone call Michael was about to make. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The October sun hung low over Maple Ridge, casting long shadows across the sprawling parking lot of the town's largest shopping center. Michael Daniels had promised his 8-year-old daughter Sophie a trip to the toy store, a reward for her straight-A report card that had arrived in the mail 3 days earlier. The drive from their suburban home had taken 20 minutes, filled with Sophie's excited chatter about which stuffed animal she wanted to add to her growing collection. She had saved her allowance for weeks, carefully counting and recounting the bills and coins in her purple wallet, making sure she had enough for the giant elephant she had seen during their last visit. Michael pulled their silver Honda sedan into a spot near the main entrance, the kind of prime parking space that usually required circling the lot multiple times on a weekend. Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt with practiced ease, her small hands moving quickly as she grabbed her backpack from the floor. The bag was a birthday gift from her grandmother, bright pink with a sparkly unicorn on the front and Sophie's name embroidered in purple thread along the bottom. She insisted on bringing it everywhere, packed with what she considered essential items: her wallet, a small sketchbook, colored pencils, a package of fruit snacks, and a photograph of her late mother. As they stepped out of the car, Michael instinctively scanned the parking lot. It was a habit formed over years of military service and reinforced by a decade in private security. His eyes tracked movement patterns, noted vehicles that seemed out of place, registered faces that lingered too long in his peripheral vision. Today, the lot was busy but normal, filled with families pushing shopping carts, teenagers clustered near the food court entrance, elderly couples walking slowly toward the pharmacy. Nothing triggered his internal alarm system. They were 3 steps from the car when Michael realized he had forgotten his wallet on the dashboard. He turned back, reaching through the open driver's side window, his attention momentarily diverted. That was when the man made his move. He had been leaning against a white cargo van 2 spaces over, his posture casual, almost lazy, but his eyes had been locked on Sophie since the moment she emerged from the car. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a faded red jacket and jeans that had seen better days, with a baseball cap pulled low over his features. His right hand was tucked into his jacket pocket, and his left hand twitched slightly at his side. Sophie had wandered a few feet away from the car, drawn by a colorful poster in the window of a nearby storefront. She had turned her back to the man, completely unaware of his presence. He pushed off from the van with practiced casualness, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. His hand extended toward the backpack, fingers splayed, ready to yank it from her small shoulders and sprint toward the van where an engine was already running. Michael's peripheral vision caught the movement. Years of training compressed into a single instant of clarity. He saw the man's trajectory, calculated his intent, registered the running vehicle with tinted windows. His hand dropped from the wallet and his body pivoted in one smooth motion. "Hey!" The word exploded from his chest with enough force to stop the man mid-reach, his fingers hovering inches from the unicorn backpack. The parking lot seemed to freeze. Sophie spun around, her eyes wide with confusion. The man's head snapped toward Michael, his expression shifting rapidly from predatory focus to startled surprise to something that might have been calculation. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Michael could see the man weighing his options, could practically read his thoughts as he considered whether to complete the grab and run or abort the attempt. The decision played out across his face in micro-expressions: commitment, doubt, fear, defiance. Then the man's hand completed its arc, fingers grasping the top handle of Sophie's backpack. He yanked hard, jerking the small girl backward. Sophie screamed, a high-pitched sound of terror and confusion that echoed across the parking lot. Her arms flailed as she tried to keep her balance, the backpack straps digging into her shoulders. Michael was already moving, his body launching forward with the explosive speed of someone who had spent years training for exactly this kind of moment. But the man was fast too, faster than his casual demeanor had suggested. He released the backpack and pivoted, sprinting toward the white van with surprising agility. Michael's hand caught Sophie's shoulder, steadying her, even as his other hand reached for his phone. He could have chased the man, could have closed the distance and tackled him before he reached the van, but his daughter was crying and shaking, and that took priority. He pulled her close, his eyes never leaving the fleeing figure. The man reached the van and dove through the sliding side door. Tires squealed as the driver threw the vehicle into reverse. Michael committed the license plate to memory in the second before the van swerved toward the parking lot exit. His phone was already at his ear, but he wasn't calling 911. Not yet. First, he was making a different call, one that would prove far more effective than any police response. "Jake, it's Michael," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I need the brothers. Someone just tried to grab Sophie at Maple Ridge Mall. White cargo van, license plate Charlie Bravo 7392, heading east on Highland Avenue." He paused, listening to the response on the other end. "Yeah, I'm serious. Get everyone you can hear. Now." Sophie was sobbing into his shirt, her small body trembling. Michael crouched down to her level, his free hand gently checking her arms and shoulders for any sign of injury. "You're okay, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe. Daddy's got you." His eyes scanned the parking lot again, this time with different purpose. He was looking for security cameras, witnesses, any detail that might help piece together what had just happened and, more importantly, where that van was heading. A woman in a blue dress hurried over, her face creased with concern. "Is she all right? I saw what happened. That man just... I can't believe... Should I call the police?" Michael nodded, managing a tight smile. "Yes, please call them. Tell them attempted child abduction at Maple Ridge Mall, and that the suspect vehicle is a white cargo van heading east." The woman fumbled for her phone, already dialing as she recounted what she had witnessed. Within 90 seconds, Michael's phone began buzzing with incoming calls and text messages. He ignored most of them, keeping one eye on Sophie and one on the parking lot entrance. 3 minutes after his call to Jake, the first motorcycle roared into the lot. Then another, and another. They came from the north and south, from side streets and main roads, a growing thunder of engines that drew stares from shoppers and store employees alike. They were members of the Hells Angels, Michael's brotherhood, men he had ridden with for 15 years, men who considered Sophie as much their family as their own children. Jake Rodriguez arrived first, his massive frame unmistakable even before he pulled off his helmet. He was Michael's oldest friend in the club, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home to find solace in the brotherhood of the motorcycle club. His leather vest was decorated with patches earned over decades of membership, each one telling a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. He approached quickly, his weathered face tight with concern. "She hurt?" Jake asked, kneeling beside Sophie. The little girl looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks, but managed a small shake of her head. Jake's expression softened slightly. "That's my brave girl." He stood, his demeanor shifting instantly as he turned to Michael. "Brothers are converging from all over the county. We've got eyes on every major road within 10 miles. That van won't get far." More motorcycles poured into the parking lot, their riders forming a loose perimeter around Michael and Sophie. These were men from all walks of life, mechanics and business owners, construction workers and retired military, united by their commitment to the club and their code of protecting those who could not protect themselves. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 60s, but they moved with coordinated purpose that spoke to years of riding together, working together, living by the same principles. Marcus Hayes, the club's sergeant-at-arms, approached with his phone pressed to his ear. He was a tall African-American man in his 50s, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Got 3 crews on Highland, 2 more sweeping the industrial district," he reported. "If that van is still in this county, we'll find it." Michael explained exactly what he had seen. The man's position near the van, the deliberate approach, the running engine that suggested a driver waiting to facilitate a quick escape. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. This wasn't random, he concluded. This was planned. They were hunting. The word sent a chill through Michael despite the warm afternoon. Hunting. It implied targeting, selection criteria, preparation. It meant Sophie might not have been the first child they had approached, and she certainly would not have been the last if they had succeeded. His arms tightened protectively around his daughter. By now, over 50 motorcycles filled the parking lot, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Shoppers had stopped to stare at the gathering, some filming with their phones, others hurrying to their cars with nervous glances. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the rumble of idling engines. 2 police cruisers pulled into the lot, followed closely by an unmarked sedan that Michael recognized as a detective's vehicle. Officer Rachel Turner stepped out of the first cruiser, her hand resting casually on her duty belt. She was in her early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that had seen too much in her 20 years on the force. She knew Michael and several of the club members by sight, had worked with them on community events and charity rides. Her expression was professional but concerned as she approached. "Michael, I got the call about an attempted abduction," she said, pulling out a notepad. "Everyone okay here?" Michael nodded, giving her a concise account of the incident while Sophie remained pressed against his side. Turner's eyes flicked to Jake and Marcus, acknowledging their presence with a slight nod before focusing back on Michael. "We've got units looking for the van. Can you give me a detailed description of the suspect?" As Michael recounted what he had seen, more motorcycles continued to arrive. The parking lot was beginning to look like a rally, with leather-clad bikers forming concentric circles around the area where the attempted abduction had occurred. Turner glanced at the growing crowd, then back at Michael. "You planning something I should know about?" she asked quietly. "Just making sure my daughter is safe," Michael replied, his tone even. "These are my brothers. They want to help." Turner studied his face for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. She had worked in Maple Ridge long enough to know that the local Hells Angels chapter, while occasionally involved in activities that skirted legal boundaries, had a strict code about protecting children and families in their community. She also knew that their network of riders could cover ground faster and more thoroughly than her limited police resources. "Keep it legal," she finally said, her voice low enough that only Michael, Jake, and Marcus could hear. "But if your people find that van, you call me immediately. No vigilante justice. We do this by the book." Jake nodded slowly, accepting the terms. Turner's radio crackled with updates, reports of officers checking various locations around the county. So far, no sign of the white van. Detective Frank Nguyen emerged from the unmarked sedan, his tie loosened and his expression grave. He was the lead investigator for the county's Crimes Against Children unit, a position he had held for 8 years. He had worked dozens of attempted abduction cases, and the look on his face suggested he recognized patterns in this one. After greeting Turner and getting a quick briefing, he approached Michael with his own set of questions. "The backpack," Nguyen said thoughtfully. "What's in it?" Michael blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. Sophie, who had been listening quietly, spoke up in a small voice. "My wallet, my drawing stuff, fruit snacks, and mommy's picture." Nguyen crouched down to her eye level, his voice gentle. "Can I see the backpack, Sophie?" The little girl hesitated, then slowly slipped the unicorn bag from her shoulders and handed it to the detective. Nguyen examined it carefully, his fingers running over the fabric, checking the pockets. He pulled out the wallet, a small purple thing decorated with butterflies. Inside was $23 in bills and coins, Sophie's allowance saved over several weeks. He replaced it carefully and continued his examination. "This is what I was afraid of," Nguyen murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He looked up at Turner. "We need to check security footage from every entrance of this mall. I want to know if this man was following them or if he was waiting here." He turned to Michael. "Had you been to this mall recently?" "Same time of day, same routine." Michael thought back. They had visited the mall twice in the past month, both times on Saturday afternoons after Sophie's soccer practice. Same parking area, roughly the same time. The realization settled over him like cold water. "They were watching," he said quietly. "They knew our pattern." Nguyen nodded grimly. Sophisticated predators often conduct surveillance. They identify targets, learn routines, wait for the right opportunity. The fact that there was a driver waiting, that they chose a moment when you were distracted, that suggests planning. He stood, his expression hardening. "This is bigger than an opportunistic grab. We might be looking at an organized operation. The implication hung in the air. Organized meant multiple perpetrators, possibly multiple victims, connections to larger criminal networks. It meant Sophie had not been randomly selected, but deliberately targeted. Michael felt a surge of protective rage, so intense it took physical effort to keep his voice steady. What do we do? First, we find that van, Gwen said. Then we figure out who these people are and what they want. His radio squawked with an update. A patrol unit had spotted a white cargo van matching the description near the county line, heading toward the industrial district on the eastern edge of town. Turner was already moving toward her cruiser, barking orders into her radio. Jake's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a moment, then met Michael's eyes. We've got eyes on it. 3 of our guys are tailing from a distance. Highway patrol is setting up ahead. Marcus was already organizing riders, sending groups to cover alternate routes and potential escape paths. The parking lot erupted into coordinated chaos as engines roared to life. Stay here with Sophie, Jake said to Michael. Let us handle this. But Michael was already shaking his head. One of the club's newer members, a young woman named Christina who worked as a pediatric nurse, stepped forward. I'll stay with her, Christina offered, her voice calm and reassuring. We'll wait inside the mall, somewhere safe, until this is over. Sophie looked up at her father, her eyes still red from crying, but clear with understanding beyond her years. Go get the bad man, Daddy, she said quietly. Michael hugged her tightly, kissed the top of her head, then handed her over to Christina's care. He watched as they walked toward the mall entrance, flanked by 2 older club members who would ensure no one got near her. Then he turned to Jake, his expression hard. Let's ride. The procession of motorcycles that left Maple Ridge Mall that afternoon would become local legend. Over 200 riders formed a thundering convoy, their engines creating a wall of sound that echoed off buildings and turned heads for blocks. They split into coordinated groups, each taking predetermined routes that would create a net around the industrial district. Police units coordinated with them via radio, an unusual collaboration born of mutual urgency and Turner's pragmatic recognition that the club's resources were too valuable to ignore. The white cargo van had abandoned the highway and was weaving through a maze of warehouses and abandoned factories on the eastern outskirts of the county. The driver, a thin man in his 40s with nervous eyes and fidgeting hands, kept checking his mirrors. He had spotted the motorcycles 5 minutes ago and knew he was being herded. His passenger, the man who had tried to grab Sophie's backpack, was frantically making phone calls, his voice rising with each failed connection. They're everywhere, Tony, the passenger hissed. We need to dump this van and get out on foot. The driver, Tony, shook his head violently. They'll run us down. We need to get to the safe house, get inside before they box us in completely. He took a hard right turn, tires squealing, racing down an alley between 2 crumbling brick buildings. But Jake had anticipated the move. His group of 20 riders had positioned themselves at the alley's far end, creating a wall of motorcycles and leather-clad men that blocked any exit. Tony slammed on the brakes, throwing the van into reverse, only to find another group of riders closing off the entrance behind him. They were trapped. Officer Turner's cruiser pulled up moments later, followed by Detective Nguyen and 3 additional patrol units. The police formed a secondary perimeter as the bikers maintained their positions. Turner stepped out of her vehicle, her hand near her weapon but not drawing it. Driver, turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle with your hands visible, her amplified voice commanded through the cruiser's PA system. For a long moment, nothing happened. The van sat idling, caught between walls of brick and human determination. Then the engine cut off. The driver's door opened slowly and Tony emerged, his hands raised high, his face pale with fear. He had seen the patches on the bikers' vests, knew what the Hells Angels represented, understood that if the police had not been present, he would be facing a very different kind of justice. Passenger, exit the vehicle, Turner commanded. The side door slid open and the man in the red jacket stepped out. His baseball cap was gone, revealing a face marked by old scars and harder years. His eyes darted between the police and the bikers, calculating odds that did not exist. He raised his hands slowly, defeat written in every line of his body. Michael brought his motorcycle to a stop at the edge of the police perimeter, Jake beside him. They watched as Turner and 2 other officers moved forward to cuff both suspects. Nguyen headed straight for the van, pulling on latex gloves as he approached the open side door. What he found inside would turn this from an attempted abduction into something far more serious. The cargo area of the van had been modified. The windows were covered with dark tinting that was nearly opaque from the outside. Anchored to the floor were several heavy-duty zip ties, the kind used for restraints, along with duct tape and a small cooler. Inside the cooler were bottles of water and what would later be identified as sedatives. But it was the laptop on a makeshift desk that made Nguyen's expression turn to granite. He called for backup, for evidence techs, for specialists from the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force. Because what was on that laptop, what the forensic analysis would later reveal, was a network. Names, photographs, locations, schedules. A database of potential targets across 3 states. Sophie's picture was there, along with details about her school, her soccer practice, her Saturday mall visits. But she was one of 47 children whose lives had been documented, studied, prepared for acquisition. The man in the red jacket, whose real name was Dennis Crawford, started talking the moment he was placed in the back of a patrol car. Fear of what the bikers might do if he stayed silent overrode his loyalty to his accomplices. He gave up names, locations, a hierarchy of criminals involved in what authorities would learn was a child trafficking ring that had operated across the region for nearly 2 years. Tony, the driver, whose full name was Anthony Marsh, remained silent initially, but cracked within hours of interrogation when confronted with the evidence from the laptop. He was small fish, he insisted, just a driver hired for specific jobs. But he knew faces, had delivered children to collection points, could identify the people higher up the chain. As word of the arrests spread through the law enforcement network, task forces in 3 states began coordinating. The information recovered from that van would lead to 14 more arrests over the following weeks. Houses raided in the middle of the night, stash locations uncovered, children recovered and returned to their families. It was the kind of case that careers were built on, the kind of rescue operation that reminded burned-out cops why they had taken the oath in the first place. But standing in that alley at sunset, watching evidence techs photograph the van's interior while 200 bikers maintained their vigil, Michael was thinking only of Sophie. She was safe. His call had brought his brothers, and together they had stopped monsters. The same code that made the Hells Angels feared in certain circles, the same loyalty that bound them together through decades of riding, had manifested today in the protection of a single 8-year-old girl with a unicorn backpack. Jake stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the police work. "We did good today," he said quietly. Michael nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tight in his throat. Around them, bikers were starting their engines, preparing to disperse now that the threat was contained. They would return to their jobs, their families, their ordinary lives. But they had responded when called, had dropped everything to protect one of their own. Officer Turner approached as the suspects were loaded into separate patrol cars. "Your information was crucial," she told Michael. "If you hadn't called your people when you did, that van might have made it across state lines before we could organize a response." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The club did good work today. Off the record, thank you." Detective Nguyen joined them, his expression still grave but with a hint of satisfaction beneath the professional mask. "We're going to need statements from everyone who had eyes on that van," he said. "This is going to be a long investigation. But Michael, you should know what we found in there. You saved your daughter from something far worse than a simple robbery. These people, they had plans." The words settled over Michael like a weight. He had known, on some level, that the attempted grab was not random. But hearing it confirmed, understanding the scope of what Sophie had nearly fallen into, made his hands shake. Jake's steady presence beside him was an anchor. "I need to get back to my daughter," Michael said. Turner nodded. "We'll need a full statement, but that can wait until tomorrow. Take her home. Keep her safe." She glanced at the assembled bikers. "All of you did the right thing today. We'll take it from here." The ride back to Maple Ridge Mall was quieter, more somber than the urgent chase outbound. 200 motorcycles moved in loose formation through the early evening streets, their riders processing what they had been part of. Some of them had children of Sophie's age, daughters who could have been in that van if circumstances had been slightly different. The brotherhood they shared was built on many foundations, but protection of the innocent was bedrock. Christina was waiting with Sophie in the mall's food court when Michael returned. The little girl's face lit up when she saw her father, and she ran to him with the unrestrained joy of a child who understood danger had passed without fully comprehending its depth. Michael scooped her up, holding her tighter than usual, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "Did you catch them, Daddy?" Sophie asked. Michael nodded. "We did, sweetheart. The police have them now. You're safe." Christina smiled, relief evident on her face. She was very brave, the nurse told Michael. "We drew pictures and talked about her favorite stuffed animals. She's a strong kid." Jake and Marcus stood at a respectful distance, giving Michael this moment with his daughter while ensuring their continued presence for security. Other club members filtered into the food court in small groups, wanting to see Sophie safe, needing visual confirmation that their rapid response had achieved its purpose. Several of the older bikers, men with grandchildren of their own, had tears in their eyes that they did not bother to hide. Sophie noticed the gathering crowd and looked up at her father with confusion. "Why are all your friends here?" Michael considered his answer carefully. "Because they love you, sweetheart. And because when family needs help, we show up." It was a simplified explanation of a complex code, but it was true enough for an 8-year-old to understand. One by one, club members approached to check on Sophie, offering gentle words and small gifts pulled from saddlebags and pockets. A teddy bear from Roger, who ran a pawn shop downtown. A bag of candy from Luis, who owned an auto body shop. A coloring book from Patricia, one of the few female members, who worked as a paralegal. These were not the fearsome outlaws that popular culture often portrayed. They were people, flawed and complicated, bound together by shared experiences and a code that demanded they protect those who could not protect themselves. As the evening deepened, the crowd gradually dispersed. Club members had jobs to return to, families waiting for them, lives that continued beyond this dramatic afternoon. But they exchanged contact information with the police, made themselves available for statements and testimony, committed to seeing this through to its conclusion. This was not over. The arrests were just the beginning of a legal process that would take months, possibly years, to fully resolve. Michael drove Sophie home as night fell over Maple Ridge. She was quiet in the back seat, clutching the teddy bear Roger had given her, processing the day's events in whatever way an 8-year-old mind could comprehend danger and rescue. Michael kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, reassuring himself that she was real and safe and here. Their house was a modest 2-story structure in a quiet subdivision, the kind of neighborhood where children played in front yards and neighbors knew each other's names. As Michael pulled into the driveway, motion sensor lights illuminated the front walk. He helped Sophie out of the car, noting how she stayed close to his side, her small hand gripping his larger one with unusual tightness. Inside, the house felt simultaneously familiar and strange, as if the day's events had shifted something fundamental in Michael's perception. This was supposed to be a safe space, a refuge from the world's dangers. But today had proven that threats could find you anywhere, that predators operated in parking lots and shopping centers, that vigilance was never optional when you had someone precious to protect. He made Sophie her favorite dinner, mac and cheese with chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, comfort food that brought a small smile to her face. They ate together at the kitchen table, the television providing background noise neither of them was really watching. Sophie picked at her food, eating mechanically, and Michael did not push her to finish. Some things mattered more than clean plates. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly during a commercial break. "Was that man going to hurt me?" Michael set down his fork, considering how to answer truthfully without adding to her fear. "I don't know what he wanted, sweetheart. But I wasn't going to let him find out. Nobody is going to hurt you while I'm here to stop them." She nodded slowly, accepting this. "Your friends came really fast," she observed. "There were so many motorcycles. It was loud." Michael smiled despite everything. "Yeah, they came fast. That's what family does. When someone needs help, you don't ask questions, you just show up." After dinner, Michael ran Sophie a bath, letting her play with her rubber ducks longer than usual. He sat on the closed toilet seat, pretending to read his phone while actually watching her, needing the reassurance of her safe presence. She sang to herself, a meandering tune about unicorns and rainbows, her voice echoing off the bathroom tiles. The normalcy of it was grounding. He tucked her into bed with extra care, checking the windows, ensuring the night light was working, leaving her door open wider than usual. "Want me to read you a story?" he offered. Sophie shook her head, already looking drowsy. "Can you just stay until I fall asleep?" Michael settled into the chair beside her bed. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I'll be right here." He watched her drift off, her breathing evening out, her small body relaxing into sleep. Even then, he remained in the chair, unwilling to leave, replaying the day's events in his mind. The moment he had seen that hand reaching for her backpack would be burned into his memory forever. The terror of those seconds before his brothers arrived, the relief of their overwhelming response, the cold satisfaction of watching those men arrested. His phone buzzed quietly. Messages from club members checking in, confirming Sophie was okay, offering support. Jake had sent a simple text. "Sleep well, brother. We've got your six." Michael smiled, typed back a quick thank you, and silenced his phone. Tomorrow would bring police statements, media attention, follow-up investigations. Tonight, he just needed to sit here and be grateful. The call he had made in that parking lot had activated a network built over years of riding together, working together, living by a code that valued loyalty above almost everything. 200 men and women had responded without hesitation, had reorganized their Saturday afternoon around protecting a single child they considered family. They had worked alongside law enforcement, had stayed within legal boundaries despite their fearsome reputation, had proven that brotherhood and civic responsibility were not mutually exclusive. When Sophie's breathing had fully settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, Michael finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had almost happened. He had come so close to losing her. If he had been 3 seconds slower in turning around, if the grab had been successful, if that van had made it out of the parking lot before anyone could react, his daughter might have disappeared into a nightmare that statistics suggested she would never escape. But she had not disappeared. She was here, safe in her bed, dreaming of unicorns and stuffed elephants. The monsters had been stopped, not by chance or luck, but by the coordinated action of people who refused to accept that evil should go unchallenged. Michael sent a silent prayer of gratitude to every person who had responded today, every rider who had dropped what they were doing to help protect his daughter. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of the trafficking ring. Dennis Crawford and Anthony Marsh were small operators in a larger network that stretched across state lines and involved dozens of individuals in various capacities. The laptop recovered from the van contained encrypted files that forensic specialists spent weeks decoding. What they found was chilling, detailed profiles of children across 3 states, surveillance photographs, daily routines, family structures, vulnerability assessments. Sophie had been classified as a Tier 2 target, meaning she came from a single-parent household with no visible support network. The traffickers had not known about Michael's connection to the Hells Angels, had not anticipated the rapid response his single phone call could generate. Their surveillance had been thorough but incomplete, a gap in their intelligence that had proven fatal to their operation. Detective Nguyen led the task force that dismantled the network over the following months. 14 arrests turned into 27 as lower-level operatives provided information in exchange for reduced sentences. 7 children who had already been taken were recovered from various locations, returned to families who had never stopped searching. The prosecutor assigned to the case called it the most significant child trafficking bust in the state's history. The trial, when it finally began 18 months later, drew national media attention. Michael testified about the attempted abduction, his voice steady as he recounted seeing that hand reach for Sophie's backpack. Several club members testified about the coordinated response, the chase through Industrial District, the decision to work with law enforcement rather than take matters into their own hands. The defense attorneys tried to paint the bikers as vigilantes, as a mob that had engaged in intimidation and illegal pursuit. But the prosecution countered with the simple truth. Concerned citizens had witnessed a crime, had tracked the perpetrators while maintaining constant communication with police, and had facilitated lawful arrests that led to the rescue of multiple children. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Dennis Crawford received a sentence of 35 years without possibility of parole. Anthony Marsh got 22 years. Others involved in the network received sentences ranging from 10 to 40 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. The judge, a woman in her 60s with 3 grandchildren of her own, delivered her sentencing remarks with barely contained fury, stating that the defendants had forfeited their right to participate in civilized society. Throughout the legal proceedings, the Hells Angels maintained a protective presence. Members attended court dates when possible, showing solidarity with Michael and other families whose children had been targeted. They organized fundraisers for victim services, contributed to counseling funds for recovered children, demonstrated that their code of protecting the vulnerable extended beyond dramatic parking lot rescues to sustain community support. Sophie, for her part, showed resilience that amazed everyone who worked with her. She attended therapy sessions recommended by child psychologists, processing the trauma in age-appropriate ways. She had nightmares for several months, times when she would wake crying and need her father's reassurance that the bad men were locked away. But gradually, the fear receded. The unicorn backpack remained her favorite, a symbol now of survival rather than vulnerability. On the 2-year anniversary of the attempted abduction, the Hells Angels organized a charity ride to benefit organizations fighting child trafficking. Over 500 motorcycles participated, raising more than $70,000 for prevention programs, victim services, and law enforcement training. Sophie, now 10 years old and riding on the back of her father's bike, served as the symbolic leader of the ride, waving to crowds gathered along the route. Officer Rachel Turner, who had responded to that initial call 2 years earlier, rode in the formation as an honored guest. She had been promoted to sergeant in recognition of her work on the trafficking case, her pragmatic decision to collaborate with the bikers rather than confronting them having proven crucial to the investigation's success. She had developed a working relationship with the club that benefited both parties, a mutual respect built on shared goals and professional conduct. Detective Nguyen had retired from the force after the trials concluded, the trafficking case serving as the capstone to a career spent protecting children. He attended the anniversary ride, watching from the roadside with tears in his eyes as hundreds of motorcycles thundered past. He had worked many cases where the endings were not happy, where children were not recovered, where justice came too late or not at all. The Sophie Daniels case reminded him why he had chosen this difficult work. For Michael, the day remained a defining moment in his life. He had always known theoretically that his brothers would respond if needed, that the code they lived by was more than empty words. But seeing 200 riders converge on a parking lot within minutes of his call, watching them coordinate with military precision to trap predators, understanding that this network of loyalty was real and functional and powerful, that was different than knowing it in abstract. He taught Sophie to be cautious but not fearful, to trust her instincts while understanding that good people outnumbered bad ones. He involved her in the club's charity work, let her see the positive impact that coordinated community action could achieve. She grew up surrounded by leather-clad bikers who treated her like precious cargo, who remembered her birthday every year, who considered her protection a sacred duty. The white cargo van was eventually crushed and recycled, its metal repurposed for less sinister vehicles. The laptop and its encrypted files became evidence in law enforcement training scenarios, teaching new investigators about the methods traffickers use to identify and track potential victims. The abandoned warehouse where the van had been cornered was torn down and replaced with a community center, a conversion that felt symbolically appropriate. Years later, when Sophie was in high school preparing college applications, she wrote her admissions essay about that October afternoon. She wrote about fear and rescue, about the meaning of community, about how 200 strangers had become family in the moments when she needed them most. She wrote about her father's calm response, about Officer Turner's professionalism, about Detective Nguyen's dedication to protecting children he had never met. But mostly, she wrote about the sound of those motorcycles, the thunder of engines that signaled safety instead of danger, the rumble that meant the monsters chasing her had nowhere left to run. She wrote about how a single phone call had activated a network of people who believed that protecting children was not optional, who would drop everything to ensure that predators faced consequences, who understood that sometimes the right thing to do required breaking your routine and riding into the unknown. The essay earned her admission to 3 top universities. She chose criminal justice as her major, intending to join law enforcement after graduation. Michael read the acceptance letters with pride that threatened to overwhelm him. His daughter, the little girl with the unicorn backpack who had nearly been stolen from him, was going to spend her life making sure other children stayed safe. The cycle continued. The code perpetuated the commitment to protecting the vulnerable passed to another generation. On the day he dropped her off at college, members of the Hells Angels formed an honor guard outside her dormitory. They had ridden from Maple Ridge to see her off. These men and women who had been part of her extended family for her entire remembered life. Sophie hugged each of them, thanked them for everything, promised to make them proud. Then she walked into her new life, carrying the same unicorn backpack, older but still functional, still decorated with her grandmother's embroidered name. Michael stood with Jake, watching his daughter disappear into the building that would be her home for the next 4 years. "We did good, brother," Jake said quietly. Michael nodded, unable to speak. They had done more than good. They had saved a life, dismantled a criminal network, protected countless other children from similar fates. They had proven that brotherhood was not just a word, that loyalty had practical applications, that a community united by shared values could achieve extraordinary things. The motorcycles roared to life, preparing for the long ride back to Maple Ridge. But before they left, Michael took one last look at the building where his daughter was beginning her future. He thought about that October afternoon 9 years ago, about the hand reaching for a pink backpack, about the phone call that had changed everything. He thought about the 200 riders who had responded, the police who had worked alongside them, the investigators who had built a case that brought justice. He thought about all the moments between then and now, the therapy sessions and court dates, the nightmares and victories, the gradual healing that came from knowing monsters could be defeated. He thought about the charity rides and fundraisers, the other families who had been helped, the children who had been recovered because someone had cared enough to fight for them. And he thought about Sophie, brave and strong, and ready to carry forward the lessons she had learned about protection and justice, and the power of people who refuse to look away when evil operates in plain sight. She would face her own challenges, make her own choices, build her own version of the code that had saved her life. But she would do it knowing that she came from people who showed up when called, who stood together against darkness, who believed that some things were worth fighting for. The motorcycles pulled out onto the highway, their engines creating the familiar thunder that had become synonymous with safety in Sophie's mind. They rode in formation, 200 strong even after 9 years, still brothers, still bound by the code, still ready to respond if the call came again. Because that was what family did. That was what brotherhood meant. That was the promise they had made to each other and to the community they protected. When a stranger tried to grab a little girl's backpack, when predators hunted in parking lots, when evil thought it could operate without consequences, they would be there. 200 motorcycles strong. Ready. Waiting. United. The parking lot of Maple Ridge Mall, where it had all begun, eventually became a focal point for the community's awareness about child safety. A small memorial plaque was installed near the spot where Michael's car had been parked that day, bearing the simple inscription, "Vigilance Protects. Community Saves." October 2015. People stopped to read it sometimes, parents with their children, teenagers curious about the story, elderly residents who remembered the day when motorcycles had filled the lot and police had arrested traffickers. The mall's security protocols were upgraded following the incident, with additional cameras, improved lighting, and staff training on recognizing suspicious behavior. Similar upgrades occurred at shopping centers throughout the county, a ripple effect of awareness that made the entire region more secure. The cost of those improvements was funded in part by donations from the Hells Angels, money raised through charity events and community support. Dennis Crawford and Anthony Marsh, sitting in their respective prison cells, had plenty of time to reflect on their choices. Both men had testified extensively during the trials of their co-conspirators, providing details that helped dismantle the trafficking network completely. Their cooperation earned them nothing in terms of sentence reduction, but it did provide some measure of redemption in the eyes of prosecutors who had to work with them. In rare moments of candor during prison interviews, Crawford admitted that he had never expected resistance. His experience had taught him that most parents froze when confronted with danger, that shock and fear created windows of opportunity that traffickers could exploit. He had not anticipated someone like Michael, someone with the training to react instantly and the resources to mobilize overwhelming force. "I grabbed that backpack and my whole world ended," Crawford said during one interview. "I didn't know I was touching a hornet's nest." The metaphor was apartment. The Hells Angels had proven themselves to be exactly that, a unified force that could be dormant for years but would swarm with devastating effectiveness when threatened. Their response had been so rapid and coordinated that law enforcement agencies studied it, trying to understand how civilian networks could mobilize faster than official emergency services. The answer, as Jake explained during one training session for local police, was simple. We care. These are our families, our neighborhoods, our children. When the call comes, you don't think about convenience or cost, or whether you're interrupting your day. You just move. That's the code. That's brotherhood. Officer Turner incorporated those insights into her training of new recruits, teaching them to work with community resources rather than viewing civilian groups as obstacles. She showed them the footage of 200 motorcycles descending on the industrial district, demonstrated how that show of force had boxed in suspects who might otherwise have escaped, emphasized that public safety was a collaborative effort requiring trust and communication between police and citizens. The lessons rippled outward, influencing policy and practice across the state. Community policing took on new dimensions, with law enforcement agencies establishing formal partnerships with organizations like the Hells Angels, creating protocols for cooperation that balanced legal requirements with practical effectiveness. It was not always smooth. Conflicts arose about jurisdiction and authority, but the overall trend was positive. Sophie's story became a case study in multiple disciplines. Law enforcement academies taught it as an example of effective civilian response. Psychology programs examined her resilience and recovery. Social work courses used it to discuss support networks for trauma survivors. Media studies analyzed the coverage and public perception. Each discipline found different lessons in the same events, proof that significance can have many faces. For the people who had lived it, though, the story was simpler and more personal. It was about a father protecting his daughter, about brothers answering a call for help, about professionals doing their jobs with skill and dedication, about a little girl surviving something terrible and growing into someone who would spend her life preventing similar terrors for others. It was about an ordinary Saturday afternoon in an ordinary parking lot where evil had made the mistake of revealing itself to people who would not tolerate its presence. It was about 200 motorcycles and the riders who piloted them, about the sound of engines that meant safety instead of danger, about a community that proved itself worthy of the word. And it was about a pink unicorn backpack, still in use years later, carried by a young woman who understood that sometimes the smallest symbols could represent the largest truths. That backpack had been targeted by predators and defended by heroes. It had been evidence in a federal case, and a reminder of vulnerability survived. Now it carried textbooks and laptops, dreams and determination, the tangible proof that evil could be defeated when good people refused to accept its victory. Michael kept a photograph on his desk at work, a picture taken during the anniversary charity ride. Sophie sits on the back of his motorcycle, flanked by rows of riders stretching into the distance. Her smile is bright and genuine, the smile of someone who knows she is protected, who understands what community means, who has seen firsthand the power of people united by shared values. Sometimes, when the world felt heavy and news reports detailed tragedies that could not be prevented, Michael would look at that photograph and remember. Remember the sound of his phone call being answered. Remember the rumble of approaching motorcycles. Remember the look on those predators' faces when they realized they were trapped. Remember justice being served and children being saved and a code being honored. And he would smile, the same smile his daughter wore in that photograph, the smile of someone who has seen the worst humanity offers but chooses to believe in its best. Because on one October afternoon in Maple Ridge, 200 people had proven that belief justified, had demonstrated that brotherhood was real and powerful and worth maintaining. The stranger who tried to grab a little girl's backpack had unleashed something he could not have predicted or controlled. He had triggered a response mechanism built over decades of loyalty and commitment. He had discovered that some communities do not fragment under pressure, but instead crystallize into something harder and more focused than any individual component. 200 Hells Angels surrounding a parking lot. It sounds like fiction, like the kind of story that gets exaggerated with each retelling. But the security footage does not lie. The police reports confirm it. The trial transcripts document it. And Sophie Daniels, now studying criminal justice at a prestigious university, carries the living proof that sometimes truth is more powerful than fiction. That pink unicorn backpack, still intact after all these years, sits beside her textbooks as she studies for exams on criminal procedure and victim advocacy. It is a reminder of where she came from and why she is here. It is proof that monsters can be stopped, that communities can protect their own, that a single phone call can activate networks of loyalty that change outcomes. And somewhere, in garages and clubhouses across the county, 200 motorcycles wait. Their riders go about their daily lives, working their jobs, raising their families, riding on weekends. But they remain connected by the same code that brought them together that October afternoon. They remain ready to respond if the call comes again. Because that is what brotherhood means. That is what family does. That is the promise they made and continue to honor. 200 strong. Always ready. Forever united. The story that began with a stranger's hand reaching for a backpack ended with a community transformed, a criminal network destroyed, and a young woman preparing to spend her life protecting others. It ended with proof that sometimes the right response at the right moment can change everything, that the bonds we build in ordinary times can activate extraordinary power in moments of crisis. And it ended with hope, the understanding that good people still exist in numbers that overwhelm evil, that communities can organize effectively against predators, that children are worth protecting at any cost. That hope persists in Maple Ridge and beyond, carried forward by everyone who witnessed or participated in those events, passed down to new generations who will face their own challenges. The motorcycles still ride. The brotherhood still stands. The code still holds. And somewhere in a college dorm room, a pink unicorn backpack rests beside a desk where a young woman studies how to make the world safer, one case at a time. Carrying forward the legacy of the day, 200 Hell's Angels surrounded a parking lot to protect one of their own. That is the story. That is the truth. That is what happened when evil made the mistake of threatening someone who had family, real family, the kind that shows up when called and does not leave until the job is done. 200 motorcycles. One phone call. A lifetime of protection. That is brotherhood. The weeks following the arrest brought a media storm that Michael had not anticipated. Local news stations camped outside his house. National networks picked up the story, and social media exploded with debates about vigilante justice versus community action. Michael declined most interview requests, wanting to shield Sophie from additional attention. But he agreed to a single press conference organized by the police department where Detective Nguyen could provide factual information about the case, while Michael could thank everyone who had helped. The press conference was held in the Maple Ridge Police Department's community room, a space barely large enough to accommodate the crowd of reporters, cameras, and microphones that showed up. Michael stood at the podium wearing his best shirt and jeans, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to get through it. Sophie stayed home with Christina, spared from the circus of questions and flashing cameras. Detective Nguyen opened with a prepared statement outlining the scope of the investigation, the number of arrests made, and the children who had been recovered. He emphasized the cooperative relationship between law enforcement and concerned citizens, carefully framing the bikers' response as civic-minded individuals working within legal boundaries. Without the rapid response of community members who witnessed the attempted abduction, Nguyen stated clearly, we would not have been able to apprehend these suspects so quickly or recover the evidence that led to dismantling this network. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief and focused. I'm grateful to everyone who helped protect my daughter, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. The members of the motorcycle club who responded, the police officers who made the arrests, the detectives who built the case. Everyone played a role in making sure Sophie came home safe that night. I hope this serves as a reminder that communities are strongest when people look out for each other. The questions that followed ranged from reasonable to absurd. One reporter asked if Michael had been afraid the bikers might hurt the suspects before police arrived. Another wanted to know if this proved motorcycle clubs were actually beneficial to society. A third asked whether Sophie was receiving therapy, a question Michael shut down immediately as inappropriate and invasive. The press conference lasted 45 minutes before Nguyen called it to a close, citing ongoing investigation concerns. But the media attention, however intrusive, served a purpose. The story resonated nationally, sparking conversations about child safety, community preparedness, and the complexities of organizations like the Hells Angels. Opinion pieces appeared in newspapers and magazines, some praising the coordinated response, others questioning whether civilian groups should be involved in law enforcement activities. The debates were passionate and sometimes heated, but they all centered on the same underlying question: what are communities willing to do to protect their children? For the Hells Angels specifically, the attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it showcased their commitment to community values and protecting innocence, potentially improving public perception. On the other hand, it drew unwanted scrutiny to an organization that preferred operating outside the spotlight. Club leadership had to navigate carefully, accepting recognition for their positive actions while deflecting questions about other activities that might not reflect as well in media coverage. Jake handled most of the press interactions on behalf of the club, his military bearing and articulate explanations providing a counterpoint to stereotypes about bikers. He appeared on several morning talk shows, always accompanied by other club members to demonstrate the diversity of their membership. We're fathers and mothers, grandparents, people who work regular jobs and pay our taxes, Jake explained during one interview. The brotherhood is about mutual support and protecting our community. What happened with Sophie is what we hope would happen for any child in danger, club affiliated or not. The charitable work the club had been doing for years suddenly received attention it had never garnered before. Local news stations ran features on their annual toy drive for underprivileged children, their fundraisers for veterans organizations, their volunteer work at homeless shelters. These activities had always been part of the club's operations, but they had occurred quietly, without fanfare. Now they became evidence in the court of public opinion that motorcycle clubs could be forces for good in their communities. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Law enforcement agencies in some jurisdictions maintained their stance that motorcycle clubs were fundamentally criminal organizations that occasionally engaged in positive activities for public relations purposes. Academic researchers published papers analyzing the sociology of outlaw motorcycle clubs, debating whether groups like the Hells Angels could truly reconcile their countercultural identity with mainstream social values. The conversations were complex and nuanced, resistant to simple conclusions. For Michael and Sophie, life gradually returned to something approximating normal. The reporters eventually left, chasing newer stories. The police completed their initial investigation and moved into the evidence-building phase for trials that would take months to organize. Sophie returned to school where she was treated like a minor celebrity by her classmates, some of whom had seen news coverage of her father and the motorcycle convoy. Teachers watched her carefully for signs of trauma, ready to provide support if needed. The nightmare started about 2 weeks after the incident. Sophie would wake up crying, convinced she heard footsteps outside her window or saw shadows moving in her closet. Michael would sit with her, lights on, demonstrating that the house was secure, that no one could get to her. He installed additional locks on windows and doors, more for Sophie's peace of mind than actual security concerns. The therapist Sophie had been seeing assured Michael that these reactions were normal, part of the processing trauma required. Jake and several other club members took turns doing drive-bys of Michael's house at irregular intervals, an unofficial security detail that helped both father and daughter sleep better. They never announced their presence, just rolled slowly past, eyes scanning for anything out of place before continuing on their routes. Michael knew they were there, could recognize the specific rumble of Jake's customized Harley even from inside the house. The knowledge that brothers were watching provided comfort that went beyond rational security assessments. The therapy sessions helped Sophie understand what had happened and why. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hernandez who specialized in childhood trauma, used age-appropriate language and activities to help Sophie process her fear and confusion. They drew pictures of safe places, talked about feelings using color-coded charts, practiced breathing exercises for when scary thoughts intruded. Slowly, incrementally, Sophie began sleeping through the night again. Dr. Hernandez also worked with Michael, helping him navigate his own emotional response to nearly losing his daughter. He carried guilt about the moment his attention had been diverted, even though rationally he knew that grabbing his forgotten wallet had taken only seconds. He struggled with anger at the men who had targeted Sophie, fury that manifested in clenched fists and grinding teeth whenever he thought about what might have happened. The therapist helped him channel those emotions into productive outlets, into advocacy for child safety rather than destructive rumination. 3 months after the incident, Michael received a call from an organization called Families Against Trafficking. They wanted him to speak at their annual conference, to share Sophie's story as an example of successful intervention. Michael was initially reluctant, unwilling to exploit his daughter's trauma for public consumption, but the organization's director convinced him that the story could save lives by encouraging other communities to organize similar protective networks. He agreed on the condition that Sophie would not be present and that her full name would not be used in any promotional materials. The conference was held in a hotel ballroom in the state capital, attended by law enforcement professionals, social workers, victim advocates, and parents who had lost children to trafficking. Michael spoke for 20 minutes about the October afternoon that changed everything, his voice catching occasionally as he relived the fear of seeing that hand reach for Sophie's backpack. But he focused most of his remarks on the response, on the network of people who had mobilized within minutes, on the coordination between civilians and police that had trapped the suspects. He emphasized that this kind of community preparedness was not unique to motorcycle clubs, that any organized group could develop similar capabilities if they prioritized training and communication. He challenged the audience to think about their own communities, to identify resources and create response plans before crises occurred. The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of people approached Michael with questions about how to organize similar networks, how to coordinate with law enforcement, how to balance rapid response with legal constraints. He answered as best he could, drawing on his military and security background to provide practical advice. Several police chiefs in attendance exchanged contact information with him, interested in developing formal community watch programs that incorporated his insights. Jake had accompanied Michael to the conference, both for moral support and to provide the motorcycle club's perspective on community organization. He participated in a panel discussion about civilian police cooperation, sharing the stage with Officer Turner and Detective Nguyen. The three of them together represented the successful collaboration that had led to arrests and rescues, and their obvious mutual respect helped convince skeptical audience members that such partnerships could work. The conference marked a turning point in how Michael thought about Sophie's experience. Instead of something that had happened to them, a trauma to be survived and overcome, it became something that could help others. The story had value beyond their personal journey, could inspire communities to better protect their children, could demonstrate that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when properly motivated and organized. Back in Maple Ridge, the Hells Angels chapter began formalizing some of the ad hoc practices that had proven effective during Sophie's rescue. They established communication protocols, created phone trees for rapid notification, designated coordinators for different geographical areas. They conducted training sessions on working with police, on documenting evidence properly, on maintaining legal boundaries during high-stress situations. What had been instinctive became systematic. Emotional response evolved into structured capability. Other motorcycle clubs across the region took notice and reached out to learn from their experience. Jake and Marcus traveled to neighboring chapters, sharing lessons learned and helping them develop similar protocols. A national conversation began within the broader motorcycle club community about community protection and positive civic engagement. Not every club was interested. Some maintained their distance from anything that smelled of cooperation with law enforcement, but enough participated to create a meaningful shift in how clubs perceive their role in society. Law enforcement agencies also adapted. Training academies added modules on working with civilian organizations during emergency responses. Protocols were developed for leveraging community resources while maintaining control of crime scenes and investigations. The Sophie Daniels case became a teaching example, studied alongside other successful collaborations between police and citizens. Progressive chiefs and sheriffs pushed for more community engagement, while traditionalists worried about civilians interfering in police work. The debates were healthy, forcing both sides to articulate their positions and defend their assumptions. Out of those conversations came better practices, clearer guidelines, more effective partnerships. Maple Ridge became something of a model, with its formal agreements between the police department and local civic organizations, including but not limited to the Hells Angels. Other communities studied and adapted those agreements to their own contexts. For Sophie, the impacts were more personal and immediate. She became more cautious in public spaces, more aware of her surroundings, quicker to stay close to trusted adults. But she also developed a sense of confidence rooted in knowing she had people who would protect her. The nightmares faded over time, replaced by dreams where she was not helpless, where she had agency and support. Dr. Hernandez called it post-traumatic growth, the development of resilience and strength through processing adversity. School became easier as the initial celebrity status faded, and Sophie was allowed to return to being a regular student. Her teachers noted that she had become more empathetic toward other students who seemed scared or vulnerable, often the first to notice when someone was struggling and to offer help. She joined the school's peer counseling program in 4th grade, using her own experiences to connect with classmates dealing with various challenges. The friendship between Sophie and Christina deepened over the years following the incident. The pediatric nurse became a regular presence in their lives, joining them for weekend activities and holidays. She never tried to replace Sophie's late mother, understanding that role could not and should not be filled, but she provided female guidance and support that enriched Sophie's development. Michael was grateful for the relationship, recognizing that his daughter needed positive women role models in her life. By the time Sophie reached middle school, the attempted abduction had become part of her origin story, but not its defining element. She was known for her kindness, her academic achievement, her involvement in student government. The pink unicorn backpack had been retired to a shelf in her room, replaced by more age-appropriate bags, but she kept it as a reminder of where she had come from and who had protected her along the way. The trials of Dennis Crawford, Anthony Marsh, and their co-conspirators stretched across 18 months, a complex legal proceeding involving multiple jurisdictions and thousands of pieces of evidence. Michael attended key hearings, wanting to see justice served, but he shielded Sophie from the courtroom drama. She knew the basics of what was happening, understood that the bad men were being punished, but she did not need to sit through testimony about trafficking methods and exploitation techniques. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. The laptop recovered from the van provided digital evidence linking the defendants to dozens of crimes across 3 states. Testimony from rescued children, though difficult for everyone involved, established patterns of operation and corroborated electronic records. Expert witnesses explained the trafficking network structure, the roles different individuals played, the financial incentives that motivated their horrific enterprise. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were small players in a larger organization, that they deserved leniency for cooperating with investigators. But the jury, composed of ordinary citizens including several parents, showed little sympathy. The verdicts came swiftly and unanimously, guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase brought victim impact statements from families whose children had been targeted or taken, emotional testimonies that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. Michael delivered a statement on behalf of Sophie and himself, his words measured but powerful. "My daughter was almost stolen from me," he said, standing at the podium facing the defendants. Not for ransom, not for any reason that could possibly justify such cruelty, but to be sold and exploited and destroyed. The only thing that prevented this nightmare from becoming our reality was the community that surrounded us, the people who refused to look away, who acted decisively to protect an innocent child. These defendants made a choice to prey on children. We as a society now make a choice to ensure they never have that opportunity again. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. Crawford's 35 years meant he would likely die in prison. Marsh's 22 years guaranteed he would be elderly before release, if he survived incarceration. Others received sentences that balanced their level of culpability with their cooperation in dismantling the network. The judge made clear in her remarks that crimes against children warranted the harshest penalties the law allowed. As the legal process concluded, the community's focus shifted to prevention and healing. Schools implemented new safety protocols, teaching children about recognizing suspicious behavior and trusted adults they could turn to for help. Parent organizations organized awareness campaigns, distributing information about trafficker tactics and warning signs. The Hells Angels participated in school assemblies, their intimidating appearance used to good effect in driving home messages about the reality of predators and the importance of community protection. Sophie participated in some of these events as she got older, sharing age-appropriate versions of her story with younger students. She was careful never to glorify the experience or minimize the danger, but she emphasized the importance of staying aware, staying close to trusted adults, and believing that help was available if needed. Her presence had impact, a real person who had survived a real threat, not some abstract story from a safety video. The anniversary of the incident became an annual event in Maple Ridge, a community gathering that combined remembrance with renewal. The charity ride was the centerpiece, but surrounding it were safety workshops, fundraisers for victim services, awards recognizing community members who had made significant contributions to child protection. It was part memorial, part celebration, part call to ongoing vigilance. Year after year, the event grew larger. What started as a few hundred participants expanded to over 1,000, drawing riders and supporters from across the state. The money raised supported local programs and national organizations fighting trafficking. The awareness generated kept child safety in the public consciousness long after media attention had faded. The community bonds strengthened, creating networks of mutual support that extended far beyond emergency response. For the Hells Angels, the ongoing commitment to child protection became a central part of their identity in Maple Ridge and beyond. New members were taught about the Sophie Daniels case during their prospect period, learning not just what had happened, but why the rapid response had been so important. The code they lived by, which had always included protecting the vulnerable, gained concrete expression through organized programs and community partnerships. Michael watched his daughter grow up surrounded by this legacy, sometimes wondering how her life might have unfolded if that October afternoon had gone differently. He saw her confidence, her compassion, her determination to make a difference, and he recognized that while trauma had shaped her, it had not broken her. The support network that had saved her physically had also provided the emotional scaffolding for her recovery and growth. Sophie's decision to pursue criminal justice in college surprised no one who knew her story. What surprised Michael was her specific interest in victim advocacy, in working with survivors of trafficking to help them rebuild their lives. She had seen firsthand how critical support systems were, how community connections could mean the difference between despair and hope. She wanted to be that connection for others who had survived what she had narrowly escaped. During her college breaks, Sophie interned with organizations that served trafficking survivors. She listened to stories that were far worse than her own, stories of children who had not been rescued in time, who had endured years of exploitation before finding freedom. The work was emotionally draining, required the kind of strength and resilience she had developed through her own healing process. But it was also deeply meaningful, connecting her lived experience to broader service. Michael supported her choices while worrying about the toll such work might take on her mental health. Dr. Hernandez, who Sophie still consulted occasionally, assured them both that working with trauma survivors could be a healthy expression of post-traumatic growth, as long as Sophie maintained boundaries and practiced self-care. The key was ensuring she did not sacrifice her own well-being in service to others, a balance that required constant attention. The Hells Angels remained a presence in Sophie's life even as she moved away for college. When she came home for visits, riders would stop by to check in, to hear about her studies, to encourage her aspirations. Jake, now in his 60s and considering retirement from his day job, took particular interest in her academic progress. He saw her as proof that their code had meaning beyond abstract principle, that their actions could literally save and shape lives. On the 10th anniversary of the attempted abduction, the charity ride drew over 2,000 participants. Sophie, now 20 years old and preparing for her junior year of college, served as the Grand Marshal. She rode at the head of the procession on her father's motorcycle, the same bike he had ridden that day when 200 brothers had answered his call. The pink unicorn backpack was strapped to the sissy bar, a symbol recognized by everyone present. The ride route passed through downtown Maple Ridge, along Highland Avenue where the white van had fled, through the industrial district where it had been trapped, and back to the mall parking lot where it had all begun. Thousands of community members lined the streets, cheering the riders, holding signs thanking them for their service and protection. It was a celebration of survival, of community, of the refusal to accept evil's victory. At the mall parking lot, a permanent memorial had been installed near the spot where Michael's car had been parked. It featured a bronze sculpture of a child's backpack surrounded by motorcycle chains, representing both vulnerability and protection. The plaque beneath listed the names of the children who had been recovered as a result of the investigation that began with Sophie's attempted abduction, a reminder that one moment of action had rippled outward to save many lives. Sophie stood before the memorial, Michael beside her, Jake and Marcus flanking them, Christina and Dr. Hernandez close by. Hundreds of people gathered in respectful silence as Sophie prepared to speak. She looked younger than her 20 years in that moment, the weight of memory visible in her expression. But when she began to talk, her voice was strong and clear. 10 years ago, a stranger tried to take me, Sophie said, her words carrying across the assembled crowd. He failed because my father acted instantly, because 200 people dropped everything to help, because our community refused to let evil win. I am here today because of all of you, because you believed a child's safety was worth disrupting your Saturday afternoon, worth riding into danger, worth standing between predators and their prey. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But this memorial is not just about me. It represents every child who was rescued, every family that was reunited, every predator who was stopped. It represents what communities can achieve when they decide that protecting innocence is not optional, that looking out for each other is not someone else's responsibility, but everyone's duty. Michael felt his eyes burning, pride and grief and gratitude mixing into emotions too complex for simple expression. He had made one phone call 10 years ago, activated a network he trusted, but had never tested at this scale. The response had exceeded anything he could have imagined, had literally altered the trajectory of dozens of lives. Standing here now, surrounded by the fruits of that desperate action, he understood the true meaning of brotherhood. Sophie continued, her voice strengthening. I am studying criminal justice because I want to spend my life protecting others the way I was protected. I want to be the person who shows up when called, who stands between danger and the vulnerable, who refuses to accept that evil should go unchallenged. You taught me that, all of you, and I will carry that lesson forward every day of my life. The crowd erupted in applause, 2,000 people acknowledging not just Sophie's words, but the collective achievement they represented. The Hells Angels revved their engines in salute, the thunder echoing across the parking lot exactly as it had 10 years earlier. For those who had been present that October afternoon, the sound triggered vivid memories, the rush of adrenaline and purpose and unity. After the ceremony, as people dispersed to various charity events and fundraisers happening throughout the day, Michael found himself standing with Jake beside the memorial. They were quiet for a while, both lost in reflection. Finally, Jake spoke. We did something real that day, brother. Something that mattered. Michael nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. They had done more than save one child, though that alone would have been enough. They had demonstrated that communities could organize effectively for protection, that rapid response was possible when people cared enough to prepare, that evil could be stopped when good people refused to be bystanders. The sun was setting over Maple Ridge as the last of the event participants packed up and headed home. Sophie was with Christina and some friends, young people her age who had volunteered at various stations throughout the day. They were laughing about something, the easy joy of young adults unburdened by the weight older people carried. Michael watched his daughter, seeing the person she had become, grateful beyond words for every moment he had with her. His phone buzzed with a message from the national chapter president, congratulating the Maple Ridge Club on another successful anniversary event and noting that similar programs were being adopted by chapters across the country. What had started as one desperate father's phone call had evolved into a movement, a nationwide commitment by motorcycle clubs to prioritize child protection and community service. As Michael drove home that evening, Sophie beside him chattering about her plans for the upcoming semester, he reflected on the journey they had traveled together. From terror in a parking lot to triumph on this anniversary, from victim to advocate, from helpless target to empowered survivor. It had not been easy or simple, had required work and support and time. But they had made it, were still making it, day by day. The pink unicorn backpack sat in the back seat, retired again after its symbolic appearance today. It would return to its place of honor on Sophie's shelf, a reminder of vulnerability survived and protection received. When Sophie had children of her own someday, she would tell them about the backpack, about the day 200 motorcycles surrounded a parking lot, about communities that cared enough to act. And those children would grow up knowing that safety was not just about locks and alarms and avoiding strangers. It was about networks of people who watched out for each other, who responded when called, who believed that protecting the innocent was worth whatever cost it required. They would learn the code not as abstract principle, but as lived reality, the story of their mother's survival proof that it worked when put to the test. Michael pulled into their driveway, the motion sensor lights illuminating the front walk. Sophie grabbed her backpack and headed inside, already texting friends about meeting up later. Michael sat in the car for an extra moment, watching her disappear into the house, safe and whole and full of promise. 10 years ago, he had made a phone call. 200 brothers had answered. Justice had been served. Children had been saved. A community had proven itself. And a little girl with a unicorn backpack had grown into a young woman determined to protect others. That was the story. That was the truth. That was what happened when evil tried to take what belonged to family, when predators underestimated the power of brotherhood, when one father's desperate call activated a network of loyalty that changed everything. 200 motorcycles. One phone call. A decade of impact. That is what community means. That is what brotherhood delivers. That is the legacy they built together, brick by brick, ride by ride, choice by choice. And it continues still, in Maple Ridge and beyond, wherever people decide that protecting children is not someone else's responsibility, but a sacred duty they all share. The code persists, the commitment endures, the network stands ready. Because some things are worth fighting for. Some people are worth protecting. And some stories need to be told, remembered, passed down through generations as proof that good can triumph when enough people care enough to act. This is one of those stories. This is Sophie's story. This is all of their stories, woven together into something larger than any single thread, stronger than any individual could achieve alone. This is brotherhood. This is family. This is what happens when a community says no to evil and means it with everything they have. 200 strong. Then, now, always.